The pier was alive with the noise of sailors on shore leave, but the laughter that erupted from the far end carried a cruel edge. Three broad-shouldered men in navy fatigues had their attention fixed on one woman. They made a show of blocking her path, leaning close, one of them tugging at the hem of her crisp white shirt. "Come on, sailor girl, give us a smile, one," jeered his voice, loud enough to draw the eyes of half the dock. She stood there, jaw tight, the humiliation burning through her cheeks, while her mind began quietly charting the course toward payback. Her name was Petty Officer Rachel Hayes, 28, a bosun's mate with 5 years in the Navy. She had learned to work twice as hard to be taken seriously, but ever since her ship docked in this small coastal town, a handful of crewmates had made her their target. It started with sly comments, the sort of offhand jabs she could brush aside. But over the past 2 days, the tone had sharpened. Their voices carried in the mess hall when they made remarks about what a girl like her could really be good for. Their laughter rang in the narrow ship corridors when she passed by. And today, here on the dock, they'd decided to escalate. She could smell the sharp tang of salt water mixing with the faint diesel scent of a nearby fishing trawler. The air was crisp, but her palms felt warm fists curling at her sides. Her training told her not to escalate. Navy protocol drilled discipline into every bone, but a different kind of instinct, one forged in years of martial arts practice long before enlistment, told her these men were pushing her toward a line she wouldn't let them cross again. One of them, the ringleader named Dempsey, took a deliberate step closer. He was tall. His uniform sleeves rolled high to show off tattooed forearms. His grin was the smug kind, the kind of grin worn by someone who believed the rules would always protect him. "What's the matter, Rachel? Can't take a little fun?" His buddies snickered, emboldened by the way she stood still, her eyes fixed on the weathered planks beneath her boots. Rachel's silence wasn't submission. It was calculation. She had learned long ago that a measured pause could be more dangerous than an immediate reaction. She let them have their moment. Let the crowd gather just enough for their arrogance to peak. A nearby petty officer looked uncomfortable but didn't step in. That stung almost as much as the taunts themselves. When Dempsey's hand brushed against her waist, she stepped back, not out of fear, but to commit every detail to memory. The angle of his stance, the distance to the nearest wall, the position of his friends on either side. She told herself she would not act now, not here, not in a way that could be spun against her. But the decision was made tonight. When they thought they still had the upper hand, she would take it from them completely. As the men finally laughed themselves out and wandered toward the town's narrow streets, Rachel stayed on the dock, staring after them. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and distant, as if echoing her own simmering thoughts. She straightened her shirt, tugged her cap down low, and walked toward the row of buildings beyond the pier. She knew where the crew liked to drink after hours. She knew they'd be there. And she knew that when she walked out of that bar later, it would be on her terms. The glow of the seaside bar spilled onto the cracked pavement outside, painting the damp street in amber light. Inside, the air was thick with the mingling scents of cheap beer-fried shrimp and the tang of sea salt carried in on sailors' coats. Rachel pushed open the door with deliberate calm, the chatter and clinking glasses momentarily dipping as faces turned toward the newcomer. Her boots made a steady, unhurried rhythm against the scuffed wooden floor. In the far corner, Dempsey and his two shadows had claimed a booth. Empty beer bottles already cluttered the table, and their voices were loud enough to bleed into the music blaring from a dusty jukebox. Dempsey was mid-story, reenacting the afternoon's dockside encounter for the benefit of two other sailors, complete with exaggerated gestures and a mock falsetto to imitate Rachel's supposed reaction. His friends howled with laughter, the sound sharp and grating in her ears. Rachel didn't head straight for them, not yet. She moved to the bar, leaning one forearm on the counter, ordering a soda instead of a drink. The bartender, a wiry man with wind-burned skin, glanced between her and the noisy booth, his lips tightening but saying nothing. She noticed the way his eyes lingered. He'd seen this kind of thing before. Her gaze swept the room like a sonar scan. She counted the distance from her spot at the bar to their booth, noted the placement of the pool table, the narrow aisle between the jukebox and the wall, and the exit door near the bathrooms. Every detail locked into place in her mind, not for escape, but for precision. If tonight turned physical, she'd need the space to control the outcome. One of Dempsey's sidekicks noticed her first. He elbowed the other and grinned, tilting his chin toward her like she was a challenge to be conquered. They didn't see the calm in her expression for what it was. They saw it as weakness. "Hey, sailor girl," Dempsey's voice carried across the room. "Didn't think you had the guts to show your face after earlier." His words drew chuckles from nearby tables, people who didn't know the full story but enjoyed the tension. Rachel turned slowly, resting her elbows on the bar behind her, her posture casual. "Guess you don't know me that well," she said evenly. Her tone was calm, but her eyes stayed locked on his unwavering. Dempsey smirked and stood weaving slightly from the drinks. He sauntered toward her, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "You should be careful," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A quiet one like you. People might get the wrong idea." His hand reached out, as if to brush her shoulder. Rachel shifted her stance, just an inch enough to plant her weight enough to prepare. The entire bar seemed to shrink around them, the music and voices dimming under the electric hum of what was about to happen. "You've had your fun," she said, her voice dropping into something quieter, steelier. "But you've been making a mistake all day." Dempsey chuckled, glancing over his shoulder to make sure his friends were watching. "Yeah. And what's that?" She leaned in just enough for only him to hear. "Underestimating me." The way she said it made him pause for the briefest second, but pride drowned out caution. He grinned wider and motioned for his friends to come closer, their laughter mixing with the scrape of chairs on wood. Rachel straightened her pulse steady, her mind already mapping the first move. She hadn't come here to endure another round of humiliation. She'd come here to end it. Dempsey was close enough now that Rachel could smell the bitter tang of beer on his breath. His buddies flanked him, the three of them forming a half circle that boxed her in against the bar. Conversations around the room slowed the weight of curiosity pulling more eyes toward them. She could feel the pulse of the moment. This was the exact point she had been waiting for. He reached out again, his hand grazing her upper arm in a slow, mocking motion. Rachel's eyes narrowed, her left foot sliding half an inch back, anchoring her weight. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Don't," she said each letter like a low drumbeat. He smirked, tilting his head like he'd just been issued a dare. "What are you gonna do? Sailor girl, call the captain on me." His friends laughed, a short, sharp sound that ricocheted through the air. Rachel moved. It wasn't the wild swing they might have expected, but a precise, explosive action honed through years of training. Her right knee shot upward, driving into Dempsey's midsection with a solid thud that knocked the wind out of him instantly. His eyes bulged, and he folded forward instinctively right into the heel of her boot as she pivoted and planted a sharp sidekick into his chest. The impact sent him stumbling back into the nearest table, knocking it sideways and scattering beer bottles like bowling pins. The bar erupted in shouts. Chairs scraped. Someone cursed, but Rachel barely registered it. She'd already shifted her focus to the two shadows who had moved in as soon as their leader went down. The first one lunged, reaching for her arm. She deflected his grab with a sharp parry, then stepped into his space, driving the ball of her foot into his shin. As he bent forward in pain, she delivered an elbow strike to his temple, controlled but hard enough to send him crashing sideways into the jukebox. The second was bigger, slower, but his reach was longer. He swung a clumsy punch toward her jaw. Rachel ducked under it, feeling the rush of air past her cheek, then came up inside his guard. Her palm strike landed squarely under his chin, snapping his head back. The shock stunned him just long enough for her to sweep his legs out from under him, sending him flat on his back. Dempsey was already trying to get up, rage and embarrassment mixing in his face. He took a staggered step forward, but Rachel stepped toward him first. Her boot planted on the floor with a forceful thud, her voice sharp and cutting through the noise. "Stay down!" Something in her tone, calm but absolute, made him hesitate. The room was silent now, except for the low hum of the jukebox and the sound of someone's spilled drink dripping onto the floor. Rachel didn't press the attack. She didn't have to. The point had been made in the way he clutched his chest, in the way his friends avoided meeting her eyes. She stepped back, loosening her stance, but her gaze never left them. It wasn't anger in her expression anymore. It was finality. One of the locals at the bar muttered, "Damn!" Under his breath, the awe in his voice breaking the tension, just enough for murmurs to rise again. Rachel took a slow breath, straightened her shirt, and stepped away from the bar toward the open floor. She knew they weren't done, not yet, but the momentum had shifted. They wouldn't forget this moment, and neither would the crowd. Dempsey's pride wouldn't let him quit. Even with the ache in his ribs and the sting of humiliation burning hotter than any bruise, he lurched forward again. The scrape of his boots against the wood was uneven, desperate. "You think this is over?" He spat, his voice tight with the strain of catching his breath. Rachel didn't move backward. She stepped in. The sudden proximity startled him, but before he could react, she seized the front of his uniform and pivoted on her heel. The movement was fast controlled, a perfect hip throw. His body lifted just enough for gravity to take over, and then he slammed onto the bar's worn floor with a hollow thump. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Someone even whistled. One of the sidekicks tried to come to his aid, swearing as he lunged. Rachel anticipated it. She sidestepped smoothly, hooking her foot around his ankle and yanking hard. He fell face first, the sound of the impact muffled by the sticky floor mat near the bar's entrance. Without missing a beat, she planted her boot between his shoulder blades, just enough pressure to pin him while keeping her eyes on the third man. That one hesitated. His earlier bravado had melted into something wary. He raised his hands half-heartedly, like maybe that could erase the fact he'd been part of the pack all day. But Rachel wasn't fooled. Hesitation didn't mean surrender. "You had no problem laughing earlier," she said, her voice carrying over the quiet room. "Laugh now." The man's jaw tightened. He didn't move. When he finally made the mistake of shifting his weight forward, she acted. A sharp front kick to his thigh buckled his leg, and before he could recover, she swept his other foot out. He landed hard breath, leaving his lungs in a quick, shocked burst. Dempsey groaned on the floor, rolling to his side, clutching his chest. His face was red, not from exertion, but from the searing realization that everyone in the bar had just watched him be dismantled piece by piece. His friends weren't faring much better, sprawled across the floor like discarded gear. Rachel eased her boot off the second man's back and stepped to the center of the room. She wasn't panting. Her stance was loose, measured. "This ends here," she said, looking at each of them in turn. "If you so much as speak to me again like you did today, you won't walk away next time." A long silence followed. Then from the far side of the bar, a grizzled older sailor muttered, "She's got more fight in her than half the crew." A few heads nodded in quiet agreement. Dempsey's mouth opened, but no words came out, just a shallow, frustrated breath. He pushed himself up to sitting, avoiding her eyes entirely. That was enough for Rachel. She wasn't here to humiliate them further. She was here to make sure they'd never try this again. She stepped past them toward the door. People moved aside instinctively, the kind of respect that wasn't given but earned. The smell of salt air hit her as she stepped outside cooler now, against her flushed skin. Behind her, the bar was buzzing again. Not with laughter at her expense, but with the retelling of what they'd just seen. She knew the story would spread through the crew by morning. And that was exactly what she wanted. The night air wrapped around Rachel like a calm after the storm. Her boots clicked against the uneven planks of the pier as she walked back toward the ship, the distant crash of waves against the breakwater punctuating her thoughts. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't need to. Those men wouldn't follow her tonight. She reached the gangway and paused, letting her gaze drift over the dark water. Reflections of dock lights shimmered on the surface, broken by the occasional ripple from a passing fish. It was quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the ship's generators, a steady, familiar sound that grounded her. Voices echoed faintly from the bar, but they weren't mocking her now. She could tell from the tone, low-clipped defensive. She imagined Dempsey slouched in his seat, muttering excuses to anyone who would listen, while his friends nursed bruises and egos in equal measure. Their swagger had dissolved in front of the entire crowd, replaced by something they'd never admit out loud: fear. Halfway up the gangway, Rachel spotted a silhouette leaning against the rail. Chief Morales, a man with 20 years in the Navy, etched into his posture. He straightened when he saw her, his weathered face unreadable. "Heard there was a situation downtown," he said quietly. Rachel kept walking until she was level with him. "Handled," she replied simply. Morales's eyes searched her face for a moment, then a faint smirk tugged at one corner of his mouth. "Words already moving fast. You made your point." She nodded once. "Wasn't just for me." They both knew what she meant. A woman in uniform couldn't afford to let harassment slide, not because it bruised her pride, but because it set a precedent. If she didn't stand her ground, someone else down the line would suffer worse. By the time she reached her berth, the tension in her muscles was ebbing. She sat on the narrow bunk, untying her boots with slow, deliberate movements. The adrenaline had kept her steady during the fight, but now her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the release of it all. She leaned back against the cool bulkhead, closing her eyes for a moment. Images from the bar replayed in her mind. Dempsey gasping for air, his friends sprawled on the floor, the stunned silence before the crowd shifted in her favor. She didn't revel in it. It wasn't about domination. It was about ending something that had been festering for too long. In the morning, she knew she'd walk into the mess hall and feel the difference. The stares would be there, but they'd be laced with something new: respect, or at least caution. The whispers wouldn't sting the same way anymore. And if anyone thought to test her again, they'd remember how quickly the tide had turned tonight. Rachel lay down, letting the low, steady sway of the ship lull her. Outside, the water slapped gently against the hull, a rhythm as constant as her resolve. Tomorrow, the sea would call again, and she'd answer not just as a sailor, but as someone who had made it clear that no one, not even the loudest bullies, could shake her. Standing up for oneself is rarely comfortable, and it's never easy when the odds seem stacked in someone else's favor. Rachel's night proved that silence in the face of harassment isn't weakness. It can be the gathering of strength before a decisive stand. The key is knowing when and how to act using skill and discipline rather than rage. Courage, when paired with control, doesn't just end one confrontation. It sets a standard, showing others that respect is not negotiable and dignity is worth defending every single time.